All right, so you want to take a deep dive into being a social work researcher. Well, get this. I was looking at this one team. They used data and they completely changed how their city was helping homeless families.
Wow.
It turned out that just building more shelters, not the answer.
Interesting.
Yeah, their research found all these hidden factors. Like one of the biggest ones was they didn't have affordable childcare, and that was pushing families back into homelessness. And that's what seems so interesting about this field to me. It's that you're not just studying the problems, but you're actually unearthing these solutions that can make a real difference.
Yeah, and that's a really good example of what a social work researcher does, right? They don't just describe what the problem is. They dig into all the data and try to find those aha moments, those insights that are really going to lead to change, like in that example that you just gave.
So it's like detective work, but for social issues instead of crimes.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of a magnifying glass and a trench coat, they've got a laptop and some comfy shoes, for those community visits. But you're right, it's all about connecting the dots. Like they could be looking at interview transcripts or poring over survey data, maybe even looking at geographic patterns to understand why is this issue happening more in this area versus that area.
And speaking of data, we've got to talk about the tech side of things because the stuff that we got from RoleCatcher.com mentions big data, AI, all these, buzzwords. What do those even mean for someone who's researching social issues?
It's crazy, right? Like imagine instead of interviewing, just a handful of people, now you can look at these massive data sets from thousands or even millions of people.
Wow.
We're talking like census data, social media trends. You can even look at stuff like school attendance records. All of that is data that can be
Oh,
used.
wow.
Yeah, and that gives you a much broader and more detailed picture of the issue that you're trying to tackle.
So it's like instead of just seeing a tree, you're seeing the entire forest and how it's all connected.
Exactly. And then you add in things like AI. That's where it gets really futuristic. Imagine AI programs analyzing case files from social workers all over a city,
Hmm?
and they're able to spot these patterns that humans just might miss.
Yeah.
They could identify families that are at risk of homelessness, maybe even before it happens, before they're in a crisis.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Talk about getting ahead of the curve.
It's like giving social workers a superpower,
I-
right? Like helping them be more proactive.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've got all this data stuff, but what about the human element, right? Because you're not just dealing with numbers here. The role catcher guide mentioned interviews, focus groups, even travel, so it's not all spreadsheets in a cubicle.
No, not at all. A big part of the job is actually interacting with people. Like they could be conducting interviews with people who've experienced homelessness firsthand, or maybe they're facilitating a focus group, like in a community center, trying to get different perspectives on an issue. And yeah, travel can definitely be part of it, especially if you're working on a bigger project that might be national or even international.
Okay, so picture this. You're a social work researcher and you're out in the field. Maybe you're interviewing somebody about, a really sensitive topic like domestic violence. What skills do you need in that moment to really connect with that person and get them to share what they've been through?
I think that's where those soft skills come in. And honestly, they're anything but soft in this field. Active listening is huge, right?
Mm.
That means not just listening to what they're saying, but how they're saying it, their body language, really trying to understand the emotions behind their story. Empathy is obviously also super important.
So you're trying to create a safe space where this person feels comfortable opening up to you and sharing really personal things.
Exactly. And building that rapport, it's essential if you want to get good information, the kind of stuff that goes way beyond just checking boxes on a survey.
Now, I see here on this role catcher career guide, they have a whole list of skills. I'm talking reading comprehension, writing, problem solving, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
If you had to pick the top 3 skills that social work researcher needs, which ones would you pick and why?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, we've already talked about active listening, so that one's definitely up there.
Mm.
But I'd have to say writing is super key and also critical thinking.
Okay, yeah, writing, that makes sense because you got to get all that info out there, right? But critical thinking, tell me more about that. Why is that so important for a social work researcher?
Well, it's about, not just taking things at face value. It's about digging deeper. So let's say, for example, you're looking at some data and it's showing that there are higher rates of depression among single mothers. So a critical thinker wouldn't just stop there. They'd be like, okay, but what's going on there? What's behind those numbers? Is it financial stress, lack of support, maybe something else entirely? They're always kind of questioning assumptions and looking at things from different angles, trying to figure out those root causes.
So it's like being a data detective, but also kind of like a philosopher a little bit.
Yeah, you could say that. Because if you can figure out the why behind the what, then you can actually start to come up with solutions that work.
That makes sense. Now, this might seem like a weird question, but how does a social work researcher like actually use writing in their work? I'm picturing like
Yeah.
lab reports, but it's probably more than that, right?
Oh, yeah. Way more dynamic than lab reports. Think about it this way. You've spent months gathering all this data. You're analyzing interviews. And now you have to actually present your findings to the people who can do something with it,
Right.
right?
Right.
Whether it's a government agency or a nonprofit or even just like a local community group, you have to present that data in a way that's engaging and persuasive and honestly easy to understand.
So it's not just about getting the facts right, it's about being a good storyteller too.
100%.
Yeah.
You're basically weaving a narrative using data, right? Using clear language, maybe even throwing in some visuals so you can make those numbers come alive for people and actually inspire them to take action.
That's really interesting. So I'm curious about the career path itself. RoleCatcher.com, they break down the typical stages of a social work research career, from entry level all the way up to like senior researcher. What does that progression actually look like day to day? Like, what is an entry level person doing all day?
Yeah, so it's definitely a journey where you take on more responsibility and your impact grows over time. At the entry level, it's kind of like an apprenticeship. You're really diving into the data. Maybe you're assisting with interviews, focus groups,
Yeah.
organizing information, getting familiar with the software and stuff like that. You're learning from the more experienced researchers.
Okay, so no coffee runs then.
Well, there might be a few coffee runs, but it's really about building that strong foundation, you know.
Yeah.
And then as you move up, you know, maybe you become a junior researcher. You're going to be taking on more independent tasks, like you might be conducting your own interviews, analyzing data sets, even maybe writing some parts of reports. So you're starting to have more ownership over things.
So how does that change even more as you go, like mid-level or senior researcher? What's that like?
That's where you really get to be a leader, you know?
Yeah.
You might be the one designing research projects from scratch, trying to get funding. Maybe you're presenting the findings at conferences.
Oh.
You might even be mentoring those entry-level folks who are just like you once,
Yeah.
You've come full circle. So you're not just doing the research anymore. You're really shaping the entire conversation around these important social issues.
That's really cool to see how far you can go and the impact you can have at every level. And speaking of impact, let's talk about getting your foot in the door. I saw in the Rollcatcher interview guide, they had some really interesting questions. Want to take a look at some of these?
Yeah, let's do it. Hit me.
Okay, so let's say you're in an interview and they ask you, can you tell us about a time that your research challenged your own biases or assumptions? How do you even answer that?
Oh, that's a good one. It's getting at something really important in this field, and that's self-awareness. I mean, you're dealing with such complex social issues as a social work researcher, right?
Mhm.
And it's pretty much impossible to go into those situations without, having your own preconceived notions about things.
Right.
What they're looking for is, can you recognize those biases in yourself? And can you make sure that they're not, affecting your research in a negative way?
So being honest about your own blind spots.
Exactly. So a good way to answer that is to share a specific example from your research, like a time when you encountered something totally unexpected that challenged your thinking.
So maybe you went in thinking one thing and then the data just totally took you in a different direction.
Yeah, exactly. And don't be afraid to talk about what you learned from that, how it made you a better researcher, more objective, more insightful.
Okay, that's great advice. Rollcatcher also talks about how important it is to ask good questions when you're in the interview. What's a good question that, a potential social work researcher could ask that would really make them stand out? That's a good point. Showing you're curious and engaged goes a long way. What kind of question would really impress a potential employer?
I think instead of just asking about, the job itself, see if you can connect with the organization's mission. Like you can say something like, I was really blown away by, your work on youth homelessness.
Yeah.
What would you say are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing in that area right now?
Oh, I like that. Shows you've done your homework.
Exactly.
You're really invested. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Everything from data analysis to interviewing skills to, like you said, telling a story with the information. But before we go, I want to look ahead a little bit. We talked about the impact of technology, but what does the future hold for social work researchers? Any predictions?
Ooh, that's a big question. Well, I mean, just imagine a world where AI could analyze tons of data to figure out which communities are going to be hit hardest by, like, climate change, right?
Right.
And then social workers could use that info to get resources to those people before things get really bad.
That's incredible.
Or how about using virtual reality to, like, train social workers on how to communicate, in a way that's sensitive to different cultures? That could really help them navigate those tricky situations. So the possibilities are, I mean, they're pretty much endless.
So it sounds like social work researchers are really going to be on the cutting edge of using all this new tech to solve some really big problems.
Absolutely, yeah. And as that tech gets even more advanced, I think we're just going to see, even more creative ways to use it to help people.
It's pretty amazing to think about the kind of impact this career can have, not just right now, but, like you said, shaping a better future for everybody. So if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, okay, this sounds like me, I want to be a social work researcher, where should they go to learn more?
Well, RoleCatcher.com is honestly a really great place to start. Their career guide breaks down, everything you need to know. We're talking education requirements, salary info, even how to write a killer resume. And their interview tips, seriously helpful.
Consider this your official permission slip to go down the rabbit hole of social work research. We just scratched the surface today, but hopefully this has sparked your curiosity. It's a really interesting field.
It really is. If you're passionate about making a difference and you love digging into data and you really believe in the power of research, this could be the career for you.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of social work research. Thanks for listening.